Thank you for joining today's presentation entitled From Zero to Metrics in 6 Easy Steps. It's my pleasure to introduce Caroline Wong, CISSP, the Security Initiatives Director at Cigital. Prior to this role, Caroline led a product management team at Symantec and security teams at Zynga and eBay. Caroline is also the author of Security Metrics, a Beginner Guide, which offers a practical and well-thought-out roadmap for implementing a security metrics program. Caroline?
Thank you, Marie. I'd like to start out by sharing a story about how I first became interested in the subject of security metrics. For me, I was working at eBay in 2006, and I was working for Dave Cullinane, who was the team's CISO and VP. Dave had proposed and secured an appropriately sized budget for the global information security team, and for the first time, we were in a position to purchase new technology and fund large projects. I, at the time, was responsible for managing the team's budget and program. Dave said to me, now that we have some budget and a program, it's critical that we have metrics to show the value and ensure ongoing investment. At the time, I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I searched on Google, I read books, and I consulted subject matter experts. In 2006, I found that the field of security metrics was filled with more theory than with practice. And so at eBay, we were sort of left to figure it out on our own. And we thought about, what if we changed our team's relationship with the product team? At that time, our primary interaction with the development teams had been to badger them on an ad hoc basis. We would come to them with piles of bugs and plead for them to fix them. Of course, the dev team was always in a situation where they had to prioritize, their work, whereas they had new features to deliver, new products to develop, and we were asking them to please fix these security issues. So it was kind of this constant back and forth. And Dave and I decided to take a different approach. We thought, what if we partner with the development team and we set joint goals to improve the software security of our customer-facing applications? So what we did was we went ahead and we tried to get buy-in at the CISO and at the VP of product development levels, and our goal was to drive down the number of vulnerabilities by 20% in 1 calendar year. Now, at the time, we were using a very basic metric. We didn't focus on categorizing findings by website components or even vulnerabilities by type. But what we did have was a useful metric in the sense that it exhibited the SMART qualities, something that we will talk about in today's session. SMART meaning specific, measurable, actionable, reasonable, and time-based. We were performing vulnerability discovery in a consistent manner, and the status was reported regularly to stakeholders. Since that time, I've continued to study and work on security metrics, and today I'd like to share 6 ideas with you. To begin with, I'd like to start with a short discussion on vocabulary. So as it says on the slide, one of the questions that I like to ask in a session such as this one is, what's the difference between a measurement and a metric? And my favorite answer to this question was actually tweeted by Eric Basie, the Senior Director of the Product Security Office at EMC Corporation. So, I said, what's the difference between metrics and measurement? And Eric said, well, clearly one's in meters and the other is in feet. I want to put out a couple of data points for us to think about. For example, today it's 60 degrees right now, Fahrenheit, in the DC area, and I had 2 cups of tea this morning. I can share these pieces of data with you, these measurements with you, but who cares? What are you supposed to think about it? I'd like to propose the idea that a metric is actually the aggregation of one or more measurements to create a piece of business intelligence. I believe that the most effective security metrics will help to answer a question or to make a decision, and it will also take into consideration the environmental context of an organization's specific business and security needs. I actually think that one of the most interesting questions for software security professionals is, what's the best way to invest and balance a limited budget in a way that's going to most appropriately reduce the risk? And now I'd like to share with you a story about using metrics in my personal life. I've been using an iPhone app called MyFitnessPal. This app helps me to track my calorie consumption and exercise, and it allows me to say, today, here's my current weight. In a month, I'd like to weigh, this desired weight. And with that type of information, the app does a simple calculation of daily calorie intake so that I can meet my fitness goal in a specific period of time. So in this case, before the app, I could ask myself, Caroline, you have this nutrition and fitness goal. What are you doing about it? And on a daily basis, on a meal by meal basis, I could think to myself, well, I'm going to try and eat healthy and I'm going to try and exercise. But without taking a look at some data, it's actually more difficult for me to accomplish my goal and to show actual results. So in this case, if I ask myself some of the questions that pertain to a metric versus a measurement, as discussed on the previous slide, when I ask myself, what's the question that this metric answers? Perhaps that question is, how can I be healthier and lose excess weight? What's a decision that the metric supports? In this case, maybe some questions are, what should I eat for breakfast today? How much should I be eating? How often? What kind of exercise should I do? For what length of time? And then, of course, what's the environmental context? I may have different personal fitness and dietary requirements than any of you, and those are certainly things that I've got to take into account. So this app, and in particular, tracking specific data with the purpose of achieving a specific objective, it helps me to answer my fitness questions and it helps me to make informed decisions. I can actually change my behavior by setting goals and measuring progress. And now that we've got some context for the discussion, let's see how I can take the story about my fitness pal and map it to some advice for you guys about security metrics. Today we're going to talk about 6 tactics for a successful program, and these are outlined here. The first is the context matters. I think it's extremely important to tailor your message to fit the interest and the need and the appropriate detail level of whoever you happen to be communicating with, whoever is your metrics recipient. One of the things that makes a metric different from a measurement is the context. And it's up to each of us as security professionals to help our audience understand if a given number is bad or if it's good. Point number 2 is that simple messages work. In this case, I believe that more is not always better because complex messages can sometimes be confusing. I recommend to my clients and to my colleagues that they use visual aids like heat maps in order to get an intuitive understanding from our audience. Security can be a very complex thing, but to the extent that we can simplify the message for the folks that we're trying to talk to about it, I believe that that can really help us when we're trying to do effective security metrics. Point number 3 is about risk management. Some organizations have very formal enterprise risk groups and very formal conversations about risk tolerance. If your organization does not have that kind of thing, we do recommend that you talk with folks and lay the foundation for risk tolerance conversations with management so they can understand what's high risk and what's not. Point number 4 is about consistent aggregation of data. There may be many cases where an exact value is not particularly useful for answering a question or making a decision, but rather a trend or the direction in which the numbers are going might actually be what's truly useful. Point number 5 is about getting specific. So we've talked about SMART goals: specific, measurable, actionable, reasonable, and time-based. I believe this is a proven way to achieve success with a security metric. It's really important that for every metrics project, there is a specific thing that you're measuring and that there are specific objectives and goals for you to reach toward. And finally, point 6, metrics drive behavior, and this can either be good or bad. It's important to make sure that the behavior you're getting is actually what you want. So we're going to dive into each of these points individually. The first one I want to talk about is context matters. I think that raw numbers taken out of context can lead to all sorts of knee-jerk reactions, or in some cases even false hope. The hard part is to put some context around some of these raw numbers that would allow people to interpret them correctly. So on the screen, what we have is, a security professional says, well, we found 9 critical bugs this month, and without any additional context, of course, I've got the 3 exclamation marks, it's hard to know if this is a good thing or if this is a bad thing. So I'd like to propose that in this case, there are a few contextual factors that might also play a role. The first is, was that expected or was that unexpected? The second might be, well, do we consider that to be acceptable or unacceptable? And the third says, what's the mean time to remediate for each of these bugs? Is it within the policy that we've set? So for example, maybe for a critical bug, we require an SLA of, fix within 24 hours. Maybe it's fixed within 7 days. Whatever the rule is for that firm, did the fix actually happen within the recommended time frame? Given that we've got a measurement, a number of 9 critical bugs, if we additionally look at these 3 contextual factors, then we've got a story that we can tell around the number. For example, I could say, well, we found 9 critical bugs this month, but that was actually completely acceptable because we knew that we would find more because we're doing this whole new way of defect discovery. For example, maybe we're doing a 3-week pen test instead of a 2-day pen test. And we also think it's acceptable because these were all found within the development cycle and all the repairs were done within policy-driven timeframes. In this case, maybe 9 critical bugs just proves that all of the things that we've put into place in our program are working. We predicted that this would happen. Yes, we had 9 criticals last month, and in this case, we should celebrate. We shouldn't be firing people. Point number 2 is that simple messages work. One of the questions that I like to ask clients when we're working together on security metrics is, does your audience understand the data that you're presenting? Do they care about the data? The answer more often than not is they could probably use some help when it comes to interpretation. Remember that any time spent in trying to help someone understand your message takes away valuable time, which could be used in actually discussing the message that you have to present. Personally, I recommend visualizations of security metrics when possible. These can help people looking at your metrics to gain an intuitive understanding of what you're trying to communicate quickly, allowing you to focus your time with that audience, talking about the message and what that means, whether it be changing behavior or changing focus of existing security investments. The next point number 3, is to introduce the concept of risk management. So at a high level, I think it's really important to understand What are the things that your executives want to accomplish? How does the culture at your firm work? How do decisions get made? And what can your culture handle? Additionally, and very importantly, what do you have the money to do? With an unlimited budget, perhaps it's very easy to say, well, we should just do more. But I think that folks who are attending today may be familiar with real life in which we don't have unlimited budgets. And it's really important to take into account the level of security investment when you're trying to do risk management. So here we've just got a list of questions to think about as you're framing your security metrics program that can help you to really align your messages with the executives and the firm goals, the culture, as well as your level of security investment. Point 4 is consistently aggregate data for decision support. Once you've figured out how to distribute your spend and address risk, it's important to define a process and gather data from it in a consistent way. So the table that I'm presenting here has to do with security controls in the software development lifecycle. In this case, we've taken into account the fact that we do have a limited budget and we're not going to be able to apply every security control to every application. So we decided to risk rank our portfolio of applications and apply security controls in a risk-based manner, such that the applications that have a high risk ranking receive more security controls, but the applications that have a low risk ranking don't need quite as many to be applied to them. In this way, we're incorporating risk management. If you've got a process like this and it's defined, then at each point along the process, you have an opportunity to gather data so that you can build up sort of this information repository to query so that you can ask questions about the process and you can answer them intelligently. So with a process like this, if we're incorporating security into the software development lifecycle, and if we are able to gather data on things like under what circumstances is this process being adhered to, for every application, can we collect data about what's that risk ranking? Did it go through a threat model? Did it go through an ARA? Did it go through static code analysis? Did it go through penetration tests? When was the last time each of these tests was performed? That puts us, having that kind of data puts us in a situation where we can start to ask questions and answer them about the security of the software that we're developing. So for example, which of the applications have been risk ranked? What are the security tests that have been performed on each application? For each type of security test, what defects were found, how many and what type, which of those defects have been remediated, which of those defects have not been remediated, and which of these have exception waivers signed by appropriate risk owners. So by setting a risk-based policy and process, gathering information, you can ask questions, and the answers to these questions can be communicated to management, to your stakeholders, in order to drive a feedback loop that gives you an opportunity to improve your process over time. Maybe improvement over time means you're getting more adoption of the process. Maybe improvement over time means you're in a position to kind of fine-tune what that risk ranking security control mapping looks like. But without the data, it's really hard to know what's going on, and it's really hard to be able to measure and manage to improvements. Point 5 is to get specific. So this is really sort of an outline of how do I proceed? How do I get started? The first thing is to understand the big picture. And those are all the things that we talked about in points 1 through 4. The second, of course, is to identify things to measure. And these can be, some questions that might help you identify what are the things I want to measure, Might be questions like, what's currently presenting a lot of risk to my business? What do I have to worry about from a compliance perspective? What's important to my executives? What's on their minds these days? What's in, what's new that's going on in the business that I need to worry about. Maybe your business is starting to go into the world of developing mobile applications. Maybe your business is starting at looking at cloud hosting. What are those business or technology changes that you might want to focus on? Those are some good ways to identify things to measure. Thirdly, it's very important to set a clear objective. It's really hard to answer a question with a number unless you've got an objective that's set that you can measure to. Establish a baseline, determine expected trends. You know, it's not always clear whether the number should be going up or down. I'll give you guys an example. Some organizations might be starting at ground zero when it comes to defect discovery. Maybe an organization, the only time they find out about a security event or vulnerability is when it gets to be a point where there's actually an incident and they're responding to it. But maybe there's no proactive defect discovery in place today. So if the software security team decides to make a decision and say, we're going to put some defect discovery into place, we're going to do some pen testing, we're going to do some static code analysis. In this case, the number of defects that you're looking at, the desired outcome is actually for those to go up. Because whereas the vulnerabilities, the bugs existed in the first place, now by putting into place these defect discovery procedures and methods, you're allowing some visibility into it. So in that kind of a case, it's really important for the number to go up. You're getting more visibility into what's going on. If, however, an organization already has established defect discovery methods and those are being performed consistently, maybe that organization wants to shift its focus to deploying things that prevent defects from being created in the first place. So maybe they're going to shift to deploying methods such as threat modeling and security reviews at a design phase. Maybe they're even interested in investing in creating some secure design patterns that their developers can use or have to use in order to prevent some poor quality code from ever getting created in the first place. If an organization that has issues, and what organization doesn't, has consistent defect discovery methodologies in place, and they're starting to put in place prevention procedures, then this is a case where you'd want to see the numbers go down. So again, another example of how context for a metric matters and why it's really important to determine what's your expected trend. Do you expect the number to go up or down? And if it does, what does that mean? How can that be interpreted and how can that be communicated to someone else? You're going to want to measure and report progress and check in periodically with stakeholders. A lot of the times the work that we as security professionals do does not happen in a vacuum, but rather depends on the help of a lot of different roles. If it's software security, very dependent on the participation of the development teams, maybe the QA teams, all the various engineering teams that are involved in creating software security and shepherding it as it goes live into production. So it's really important to consistently be checking in with the other folks who are going to affect the data that's coming into your metrics program. Point number 6 today is about metrics driving behavior. And the content that I have on this slide is really about expected benefits of security metrics. Why would you do security metrics? Maybe because it gives you visibility, maybe because it gives you a common language with which to talk to other stakeholders and sponsors in your program about, so that we as security professionals can help non-security people to understand some of the complexities of what we have to deal with in our everyday lives. And finally, improvement. Hopefully, security metrics put us in a position where we're able to manage things better, make better decisions, and drive change throughout the organization. The other point I want to make on this slide is that it's really important that your metrics are driving the right behavior. It's important to think about when you put an initiative into place, when you put a metric into place, when you put a metrics goal into place and you socialize that with people, then what's the behavior that you want them to do? I'll give you guys an example. Maybe a firm decides to put into place some static code analysis. And maybe the software security leader gets really excited about it and says, you know what, static code analysis is great. It finds all these things that we didn't know about, and I really want us to take action on fixing the things that we find. So maybe the software security leader begins to evangelize this metrics goal of, well, static analysis findings must be 0 before code can be put into production. So if that's out there, then maybe depending on what kind of knowledge a development team has, what kind of incentives they have, what sort of tools or resources they have to actually fix the bugs, it's possible that with a goal in place like static analysis findings must be 0 before code can be put into production, what if developers are simply marking all of their bugs as false positives and then moving on with their lives? This is another reason that it's really important to talk to the people who are going to be affected by a metric in order to get their take on it. Some questions that are important to discuss with people who are going to be affected by the metric are, is it a reasonable metric? What sorts of motivations and incentives do they have from a business perspective to either align with or fight against or try and hide the fact that they're fighting against the metric? Do they have the tools and the resources that they need to accomplish the goals? Deploying a static code analysis project is not the easiest thing to do. And for a developer who might not know that much about security, might not have that much information about how to use the tool, how to fix the things that are being found, maybe it's just easier to mark the bugs as a false positive. And if there's no process check to ensure that that's not being done, then you might actually find yourself in a situation where the static analysis findings are 0 before code can be put into production, but in fact it's not at all driving the actual result or the outcome that you want, which is more secure code in production. So this is kind of the takeaway slide for today. I'd like to put out as a question to all the folks participating today, what are the metrics that you're using to answer questions and make decisions about security? What kind of questions, what kind of decisions, who's doing the asking, who's doing the answering? In some cases, particularly in an area like software security, sometimes an executive is not as familiar enough with the subject to really know what to ask. And that makes it the responsibility of the software security leader to figure out what are the questions that I should be able to answer, and how can I provide this information in a way to my management that's going to educate them about the problem they're trying to solve, and also get their buy-in on the approach that I'm trying to put in place and help me get the resources I need to appropriately manage this risk. What's the goal of your metric? What's the environmental context of your metric? I do recommend that you think about what kind of questions you're asking before you go after the data. In some of our early attempts at metrics several years ago, we had kind of gone down a path of saying, okay, well, what are all the security technologies we have in place? What are all the possible data fields that could come out of those technologies? And can we kind of look into this magic crystal ball of this pile of data and sort of derive something really useful out of it? For us, it might be different for you guys, but for us, that turned out to be a not particularly fruitful effort. So now what I recommend to my clients, and when I, you know, kind of take on metrics projects myself, I think about what kind of questions I want to ask and how to answer them before I go out and collect a bunch of data. Finally, remember that data is only meaningful when presented in an appropriate environmental context. I want to point out a couple of resources. I'm hopeful that folks found today's conversation to be useful. And if you're interested in learning more, here are a couple of things that you could look at. First is the Security Metrics book, available on Amazon.com. The second is something that I worked with a number of industry experts a few years ago. The Center for Internet Security Consensus Security Metrics Definitions. Clients are frequently asking me, Caroline, what kind of metrics are other people using? What are the standard metrics that I ought to be putting in place? And a few years ago, a bunch of us got together and tried to answer this question. And we put together some very detailed and well-defined metrics. The intent was that maybe if folks started to take this kind of thing up, then we'd be able to anonymize metrics information between organizations and we could enhance some information sharing. And as time went on, we realized that it was a little too early for the industry to really hook on to an idea like that, as well as, and it's come up many times in the webinar today, it's really important for any organization's security metrics to be tailored to that particular organization, maybe even tailored to the detailed level of a particular process, a particular line of business, a particular risk tolerance. So it's really hard to say, here's a security metric that's going to work for everyone. But if you are getting started with security metrics, or you want to compare your existing security metrics to something that's out there, then I do recommend the CIS consensus metrics definitions as a great place to start, and at least a good place to get some ideas upon which you could build and which you could apply some of your own environmental context for use within your organization. Gary McGraw does a show called the Digital Silver Bullet Podcast. To date, there are more than 100 podcasts available online. Gary interviewed me for show 91, so that's another interesting thing if you're into metrics. And finally, today, we're talking about security metrics, but I've really talked more specifically about software security, what some folks might refer to as application security, security in the software development lifecycle. If this is something that's interesting to you, then I'd recommend that you check out Gary McGraw's book, Software Security. At this time, that's all the prepared material that I have for today. We would like to open it up to questions as we've got about 10 or so minutes left. So we do have a question. Thank you very much to the person who submitted this. And the question is, do you have any tips for getting buy-in from executive management for a metrics program? My thoughts on this are, how can you make security metrics, attractive to management? Of all the different things that they've got to fund and that you've got to fund and all the activities that you're doing in your security program, how could you possibly set some money and time aside to do security metrics? And I'd actually like to think that maybe we go back to the basics of what's the point of security metrics in the first place. Hopefully, it's to help you answer questions and make decisions about how to make your program better. If you've got, a program that's going, but you don't really have sort of a metrics or a numbers-based way to answer questions like, are we investing enough? Is this particular static analysis capability or whatever else capability, threat modeling capability, is it effective? How would we know if we're doing the right thing? So if you've got an executive who kind of feels like you're already doing everything perfect, something like security metrics might be a little bit of a tough sell. But on the other hand, if you've got an executive that's a little bit curious about, well, here's our program today. What are we going to do about it tomorrow? And how would we make those decisions to know where differently to invest, how to, measure my current activities in order to determine if they're meeting my expectations. Maybe from an executive perspective, there's a simple question about, well, I don't even really know what's going on. I'd like to have some visibility. I think one of the nice examples presented today was the one about, hey, we found 9 critical bugs last week. What does that mean? Perhaps in your organization, you've got an example of a number that you could talk about, but that you're not currently really gathering or using things like contextual factors to interpret that data and help yourself as a manager of a program or an executive to understand, what does this mean and what should we do about it? So I think it really comes down to a couple of things. Asking your executive and having a conversation with him or her about, are there questions that they have about your program? And if they don't, and they're not necessarily going to, because after all, they're not the security experts, we are, it might be worthwhile planting some questions in their head and saying, look, today we don't really have the answers to these questions, but if we put a security metrics program into place, then I'd actually have like a measurement-based way to answer some of these questions and to put some context around some of the decisions that we're making. So the decision making is not just about smart guy or smart gal thinking, but there's actually some science behind it. Thank you. I'm hopeful that that answer was helpful to folks. The second question is, who owns a metrics program and which teams or people should be included? So I've seen this done a bunch of different ways. The most common way that I've seen is for a security leader, whether that be in a more focused group like a software security or an application security group, or at the level of a chief information security officer, to have a metrics person or a metrics team reporting to them. Now, metrics from a resourcing standpoint on a team is typically going to have 2 different components to it. One piece is going to be kind of the business or the strategy piece. Somebody, and that might be the CISO, him or herself, that might be the software security group leader, or that might be kind of a business or strategy minded metrics person that reports to one of them. This is going to be the person thinking about, what are the things that we're going to measure? How are we going to measure them? What are the business questions we're going to ask? What are the decisions we're trying to make? What are the processes that we have in place today or that we're planning to put into place tomorrow? And what are some target objectives that we have for those processes or for those activities? So there's got to be some person on the team who understands what the team does and has enough business context to be able to ask some intelligent decisions about it. Now, that is half of the structure. The other half, and the second component that I really recommend, is somebody who can work with data. For security, we're sort of lucky in that a lot of our security technology that we have deployed does spit out an awful lot of data. Typically, a security metrics program is going to involve aggregation of data from one or more different sources. And the person with those business strategy skills might not be the same person with the technical skills who can figure out how to instrument various tools and various processes in order to gather the data that you need for your metrics program in a way that's going to be automated rather than manual. So my recommendation is, depending on what level security metrics are going into a program, maybe it reports to a CISO, maybe it reports to one of his or her direct reports and focuses on a more specific area. And I do think that maybe it's 2 people or maybe it's 2 components, but there's definitely a business strategy piece of it, and there's typically also a technical instrumentation piece to it.
Thanks, Caroline. We're coming close to time, so we're unable to take any additional questions, but we'd like to thank everyone for attending today. We hope you found the session to be valuable and informative. Both the recording and slides will be available for download on the Cigital site. Thanks again, and hope to see you at one of our future webinars.